This energy is the energy of action, perception, action. When we see something, we must act. And it's also a state of lots and lots of ideas, and we're entertaining ideas, and we're being entertained by ideas. And not to say they're facts, they're just ideas. And I remember watching an interview with David Bohm, Dr. David Bohm, and he said to David Suzuki that we need another source of ideas. And to me, this other state is a good source of ideas. It's a source of ideas that most of them don't come from a person's ego consciousness. And also, Einstein talked about problems won't be solved by the same level of thinking that created them. This, again, to me, is a different level of thinking. It's not all completely coherent and intelligible, but it's a different level. And maybe there's 99 not so great ideas to every one good idea, but there might be a million times the ideas than a person in ego consciousness will ever get. And I feel some of these could be harvested for the good. And a lot of us create visions and have these visionary experiences of how to help the world. If we put those together, I think a lot could be created. So in that state, there is a wider range of thought associations, and it's making new associations and new connections, and a lot of that is based on the patterns one sees in reality, and one is learning through that pattern recognition and extrapolation process. Mania is like the universe brainstorming through you. It shakes up the prefrontal cortex, which is a lot of the ego thought structure. It shakes it up, it scrambles it. J Krishnamurti has a great quote that he repeated often: I am the world and the world is me. And he said it as it is a fact. And I believe it was a fact for him. This is how he experienced the world. And it's not something that you can say verbally, and that doesn't mean a person experiences it. In my mind, a person in mania experiences the world as I am the world and the world is me. And this can be ecstatic and this can be terrorizing, depending on what is going on in a person's consciousness. And to go in that state and first be awakened to the fact that one is the world and the world is one, especially the first time, can be very troubling, and it perhaps gets easier over time. It's like opening the can of worms the first time. If I was the world and the world was me, how would I want to be? How would you want to be if it was just one thing? And I am the world and the world is me also implies complete responsibility, and he talks about this too, that we're each responsible for the whole world. And in the state of mania, we actually do feel completely responsible for the whole world. And I think that's why a lot of people feel like I have to save the world, or I'm a hero, or there's some kind of plot going on, because we just really feel like complete responsibility for the world. And that can be associated to a lot of different metaphors and stories. When a person is in that state, any kind of story can be made up in one's mind in order to confirm that felt sense of this is how it is. And there's a truth to that we are each completely responsible for the world. When this energy comes in, it's like having a conversation with the universe, with the cosmos. It's no longer having this monologue happening in one's head about one's own personal ego complexes, but it is the universe having a conversation through you, with you, as you. And it's talking with that. And that conversation, it's not like a linear, logical, rational conversation, because the universe doesn't really work on rational principles. The ego mind works based on logic and rationality. When that breaks down, whatever it is that's coming through is not going to be logical and rational, because the ego is no longer filtering it that way. And so it's a matter of listening and witnessing the conversation without taking it too personally, I think. And I feel like if the psychosis process is initiated, which is like the downswing, it's like the deceleration, it's coming back to one's ego consciousness. It's almost like biofeedback, that I'm on the path, or I'm on a path that's not quite right, or it's just part of the coming back process, or I'm involved in doing things that I'm not supposed to be doing. And not as in that's wrong, it's just I'm wasting the energy that I've been gifted with. And that's a part of embodying the mania too, is practicing so that when the energy comes back, one can make it relational, as opposed to squandering it. And I feel like the land of that altered state that goes between mania and psychosis is, I've called it map land, because it's like a map making land. It's like the body, and psychosis is kind of a compass, kind of keeps one on track in a way, or eventually it's a compass that leads eventually back to one's ego consciousness, because it's difficult for a person to stay in that consciousness indefinitely when it's not embodied in the neurology and the physiology, and it's not the way society is designed. But I feel like that state is trying to design the society in the way it needs to be, for that to be the way people can be. Imagine if people could actually be their unscathed self. Mania is like trying on possibilities. The ego is very attached to consistency. And mania is very disorganized, because the ego is the organizer, and at that point it's scrambled, so it's not able to do its version of organizing. And I think that scrambling is necessary for the self-organization of the universe, to reorganize a person's internal structure for them to be how they need to be. And of course that's usually screwed up by medications. We are something beyond the ego, and then we medicate ourselves to stay chained to the ego. We have medicalized this entire process, and it's a process of one's magic being ignited. It's the false ego being broken apart by life energy. The ego is just habit, it's programming, it's conditioning. It's not even life. It's conforming to a pattern. And then this life energy comes in and gives us so many more possibilities and degrees of freedom. And we call this ill, when really I think that people have a lot to learn from this state. This other state, this map state, this manic state, is like the universe doing neuro-linguistic programming. It's changing the way we speak, what we say, how we say it, the sentences we use, the words we use. And it's like the universe doing neuro-linguistic programming through us, and changing us into neuro-linguistic programmers. So that's another part of embody one's mania, is the neuro-linguistic and the gestural behavioral things we need to be in order to repattern and reprogram reality. And it's not even reprogramming, it's deprogramming, because there are these natural ways of us being that we don't get to be because we're programmed. And the energy seems to want to tell us, hey, we can change the world. We are as gods. And we all are. And we do want to help the world. And it's, again, back to the world centricity thing. The energy of mania changes our behavior. And a lot of our behavior becomes, virtuous in a way, in that we're being giving and we're sharing, we're being altruistic, and we're actually at the same time decoupling ourselves and not being entangled with the social morality of competition and anger, aggression, violence. A lot of people go through these states, have a very difficult time with those types of behaviors in that state. I remember being very sensitive to any kind of violence or anything like that, because again, a person in that state is very sensitive and you can feel that. And again, even if one isn't in that state, we're still being bombarded by that stuff, and it is affecting our psychophysical, spiritual energy. It is affecting our being. It is getting saved in our cellular memory. And that's happening to all of us all the time. Like all the stuff that, all these toxins of these memes that are being stored in us are just unimaginable. And that's another reason why it's sometimes difficult to come back into society and fit in competition, in competitive jobs and things like that. If we could create a world based on the behavior of somebody in the peak beauty of mania, this world would be a beautiful place. And we would all be our most beautiful, magical version of ourselves. Guaranteed. Mania is actually a righting mechanism, meaning it's righting the ego. It's putting in its proper place, especially when one is in the manic state. It's trying to make it right. And then this whole process is pathologized. And it seems that there's a thought around how these thoughts are bad and causing bad behavior. A lot of that is actually thoughts and behaviors of mainstream society, and that's often what a person reconnects with when they're coming back to their ego consciousness. And it's very confusing, and it's very disorientating, and it's very disturbing to think, oh crap, I'm back in this realm of crap. And so one can be, more like violent and all these things that one was very disconnected with in the state of mania. But it's almost, again, like a fight for one's life in a way. It's like fighting for the life that one just was, and now they're back in this sort of pseudo living arrangement. There's dis-ease in disengaging from these thought patterns and the people that gave them to us. It's difficult to come back. So the programming and the conditioning and the thoughts are actually the dis-ease. And another thing about the embodying one's mania and behaving in certain ways, the altruistic ways of being, the spontaneous social behaviors, these behaviors are actually going to change one's thought patterns. They're even going to change what a person says, because certain gestures go with certain things to say and certain intentions. So that will actually reprogram some of the ego thought patterns that are less good. And I've mentioned before how it would be amazing to design this altruism into one's life right away after a crisis of some sort. because it moves a person back into alignment with that which the process was trying to create. It's almost like we get that energy and we use it all, a lot of it, in trying to help and in action, and it eventually dissipates and we almost nearly kill ourselves being temporary heroes. And a person isn't really seen as a temporary hero, they're seen as a mental patient, when really the experience is more like being a temporary hero and almost in a battle, or not through all of it, but some of it feels like quite a battle, at least the coming back to ego consciousness process. It's quite a fight, and to make it through alive, it doesn't always happen. So people aren't really acknowledged, like, for what they really go through. It's such a process. It's almost like a war of a different kind in part of it. It's like a war to come back to the ego consciousness world and survive. And while a person is in that state of mania, they're actually kind of like a hero doing what they can do while they're in that other state with that other energy as that animated self that they are. And it's a temporary thing, but a person gets some good work done and then they come back and they aren't rehabilitated from that perspective. They're often mistreated. And that energy that animates us, we are not that animated on a daily basis because of our thoughts and our thinking. How often are we about to do something, but we overthink it, or we second guess ourselves and we don't perform that gesture or that action because we think first and then we stop ourselves. Every time that happens, that actually kind of changes our muscles, and it saves that tension in our body. And that's how over time a lot of us get sort of contorted and distorted in the way we stand and the way we walk. We don't even notice, but it's not natural, and it's not good for the body in space and the effect of gravity. If you look up the information around Rolfing, it's really interesting about how over time gravity hunches us over and stuff like that. But if we're standing properly and straight, it's not going to affect us in that way. And even just look at the effect of how technology is changing body shapes, from people sitting all the time and having extra weight, to kids on phones, or anyone who uses a lot of technology and is constantly hunched over to look at it. I've seen people in their early 20s who their head is like a foot in front of their body. It is not good for the body, because if it's that way when a person's 20, their head is going to be down at their freaking navel by the time they're 50. I think a synonym of mania is energy, and also light, and possibly quantum, and hologram, and learning, and also play and creativity, which are part of learning. And the energy, it comes in and animates us in a way that we act in different patterns, and that way of acting actually re-patterns reality. There are special messages, and the special messages are trying to help us get back to that light body version of ourselves. And the special messages feel special because they're coming from something other than the ego monologue. They're a different source of words and thoughts and insights and ideas. And that can feel special when it's not the normal blah-de-blah that one is used to. So they're special in that way, that it's not what one is used to, but they might not be that special in that once one gets used to it, it's not really that special. It could just be the way our brains are designed to see and learn and act, that we've been conditioned out of doing. In that way, I feel like the first experience feels very extraordinary, and then over time it can actually just be the way one is, as that energy is trying to animate us in a certain way. If we practice animating ourselves in that way, like I mentioned before, we might not even really notice. But the thing is that in that state, animated in that way, we think, this is perfect, this is wonderful, I don't need anything, just being this way. So if we practice to become that, we don't necessarily need the energy, because we'll probably still have that sensation that, hey, this is how I want to be. So I don't, like, if I can be me and I can be how I want to be, then I don't need any extra state. I don't need entertainment. I don't need pleasure traps. I don't need all these things that hijack my attention. And I also feel that this energy is, it's not just about normalizing it, but it's about extraordinizing reality, making it a bit more extraordinary. And I think I've talked in different videos about how it's a hyper meaning state. We're ascribing extra meaning to everything. Well, we're trying to make the world a little bit more meaningful. This other state also shows that we have other faculties and senses besides the physical senses. Being able to sense how someone's feeling, being able to understand something by looking at it, experiencing one's past life, the list goes on. And I feel like some of these gifts are great, and some of them, like maybe some of them are temporary, and then maybe some of them can actually be cultivated in daily life. But also there has to be some kind of point to them. I guess I'm just trying to say that being attached to any of them could be problematic. In ego consciousness, we see our personal problems, but in world-centric consciousness, we see the troubles of the world. This other state is a temporary suspension of the ego, or scrambling of the ego, just as if a person takes an illicit drug, there's a come down, and it's often quite distressing. Now, a person going into manic consciousness and they're coming back to regular consciousness, there's also a come down. And it doesn't mean it's a mental illness, it just means come downs are hard and difficult. And especially if one goes into an organic mania and is there for a long period of time, the come down's going to be quite difficult and long oftentimes. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean it's a mental illness. It's just a person's coming back from a different state of consciousness. And in that other state of consciousness in mania, if we're not thinking with our personal ego process, then the universe is thinking for us and through us. And we can either be a host to the thoughts of the universe, which a lot of times are like wonder and awe. So a thought of wonder isn't necessarily saying that's how something is. A lot of what I'm talking about is actually just wondering and being curious, not actually trying to find facts. And like with all this talking, really it's to me about altruism, or being in the state where one is altruistic without thinking I'm being altruistic. And I think the ego thinking process actually decreases the bits of information available to us from the universe and what we're seeing around us, because it's filtered through the ego. And to go with that, I think that so-called hallucinations and delusions are actually the universe kind of showing us like the ego is not in charge. It's not the author of this. It is very weak in comparison to the strength of what can come through and be shown to the light of perception. And to me, it's like the growing pains of the universe trying to take root in the brain. Right now, the ego has its roots in the brain, but the universe wants to reclaim the brain for its own purpose, not for our own individual programmed desire, pleasure, dopamine hits. In this way, I think that adding to the ego in personal growth is actually false. It's just adding new thoughts and concepts which can be blown apart by the universe on any given day. And when you think about how entrenched the brain is with ego thoughts, the brain has become kind of a vestigial organ. It's just not really doing much but playing thoughts on repeat. And the thoughts are kind of like chewing your gum and swallowing it, and they're just kind of caught in there. And then we think that there's like value in that. Thought turns our brain into a vestigial organ instead of a living organ, living with what one is actually seeing. The ego is the disease to this energy. It blocks this energy. It makes us one-dimensional beings, and this energy animates us in multi-dimensional ways. And normal means having this consistent, steady state ego. I can imagine one day this will not be the desirable way to be. And I've talked before about the adjacent light body possible self. It's our quantum hologram of untouched information and energy. And the reason why we're not collapsing the wave function around being this version of ourselves is because of how we're thinking. And we're not thinking in terms of that way of being. Thinking in terms of thought actually makes us not be that version of ourselves. And our eyes, they get trapped by thought, and then that is the author of our life. That's the compass of our life, is that limited range of thoughts. That's the compass of what we can see. So when that energy comes in, breaks up our ego thought and scrambles it, that's why we can see, because that thing, that filter, that judge, that chooser, that liker, that disliker is broken up and suspended, and all of a sudden we can see something beyond our own personal tastes that we've decided to use to navigate reality, which is just conditioned. And in that way, we're actually interacting with living things and something that's really there, not just our choice of what we perceive to think is there.